You have been sold a comforting fiction. We were told that a specific, highly advanced social model could gracefully balance profound generosity with completely unmanageable demographic change. We were assured that humanitarian ambition and the survival of the welfare state were naturally, automatically compatible. But the data reveals something much, much darker, a hidden, tectonic crack in the foundation of what many consider the world's most humane nation. The machinery of that ideal isn't just breaking down, it is being intentionally, systematically dismantled. This story isn't about evolution. It is a quiet, ruthless transformation that mainstream consensus has either missed or decided to ignore. Look beneath the smooth surface of international praise. For decades, a specific European nation championed the image of openness, setting the standard for compassion on a global stage. The expectation was that integration would follow naturally, fueled by resources and good intent. But that assumption didn't match reality. Natural integration was, in fact, a failed concept, and that initial failure has now been eclipsed by the state's counteroffensive. While other nations debated theory, this country reached for the bulldozers, and when they began to calculate the cost, the numbers were impossible to ignore. In 2018, a dry report from the Ministry of Finance laid bare a staggering structural defect. Immigrants from non-Western countries and their descendants were causing a net deficit to the state budget of about 31 billion kroner a year. That's roughly $5 billion annually. For a country of just 5.8 million people, this statistic was an explosive diagnosis. It wasn't just a financial footnote, it was the entire premise of the social contract beginning to fray under pressure. This report wasn't an isolated anomaly. It was the final trigger for a radical political pivot. That paradox is the engine driving these policies. Denmark isn't accidentally drifting into harshness, it is engineering it as a survival mechanism. They reached a stark conclusion: if they didn't lock the border doors, they would lose the keys to the entire welfare system. This isn't about abstract principles, it is a direct, transactional exchange, the preservation of the Danish safety net, traded against the dream of a welcoming, inclusive world. But in securing one, have they irrevocably warped the other? The structural shifts we are now witnessing are only the beginning of a deeper, more profound transformation that will reshape not just Denmark but the entire continent. And this is only the beginning of what the data reveals. The machine that once sustained absolute trust is now producing a completely different currency: systemic isolation and mandated cultural engineering. We are no longer observing a simple policy adjustment at the borders. What we are witnessing is the mechanical re-engineering of domestic life itself, driven by the cold mathematical realization that a high-tax, high-benefit system cannot survive when large segments of the population remain structurally disconnected from the workforce. The state has shifted from a philosophy of passive assimilation to an aggressive, state-directed campaign to physically and socially dismantle concentrated immigrant communities. This transformation operates through precise urban zoning and demographic quotas. Under the policy framework initially introduced as the Ghetto Package, the government established a rigid mathematical definition for communities deemed incompatible with Danish social norms. An area is legally classified under this rubric if it meets specific thresholds for unemployment, crime, and education. But the structural fuse is entirely demographic. More than 50% of the residents must be of non-Western descent. By law, the state has mandated that the proportion of public housing in these designated hard-hit zones must be aggressively compressed down to a maximum of 40% by the year 2030. The human consequence of this math is measured in absolute displacement. To hit a purely artificial legal percentage, the state has authorized the mass privatization and physical demolition of entire residential blocks. This is not standard urban rejuvenation. It is the forced eviction of thousands of individuals who have committed no crime other than living in a zip code that failed a demographic audit. Elderly residents who have paid their rent reliably for over 30 years are handed formal notices requiring them to leave their communities, uprooting decades of localized social support networks in the name of statistical compliance. The intervention scales down from architectural demolition to the policing of the family unit. Under the education mandates woven into the integration framework, children living in these vulnerable zones who have reached just 1 year of age are legally required to attend public daycare for a minimum of 25 hours per week. If a family resists or attempts to keep their toddler at home, Within their own cultural environment, the state immediately terminates their child benefit checks, cutting off vital financial support. The consequence is an immediate erosion of parental autonomy, forcing mothers to surrender their infants to state-approved facilities where the curriculum explicitly mandates instruction in state-defined values and traditions on the ground. Inside the red brick blocks of Mjolnirparken in the Norebro district, this mechanical reality loses all its policy abstraction. Walk through the courtyards today and you do not hear the normal sounds of a thriving residential neighborhood. You hear the low, rhythmic hum of excavators idling behind chain-link fences. In the local corner shops, windows are taped over, and the bulletin boards that once held community notices are covered with administrative announcements detailing relocation procedures and legal aid contacts. A long-term resident named Asif, who has operated a small bakery near the edge of the complex for 2 decades, watches the slow evacuation of his customer base from behind an increasingly empty counter. He observes that his business didn't decline because of bad management or a shifting economy. It was systematically emptied out by the state's zoning laws. Each week, another handful of families pack their lives into boxes, forced into unfamiliar municipalities where they know no one. Asif notes that when you tear down the buildings, you don't magically integrate the people. You simply scatter their isolation across a map where it is harder for the cameras to find. This calculated disruption is not a random anomaly unique to a single housing project. It follows an intentional, highly organized pattern of domestic defense that is visible across multiple municipalities. From the streets of Volsmos in Odense to Gellerudparken in Aarhus, the state has fundamentally redefined its relationship with the individual, abandoning the liberal assumption that citizenship is a neutral legal status. Instead, Denmark has pioneered a model where geographic location dictates the level of state intrusion a family must endure. The bulldozers and mandatory daycare centers are part of a unified, highly coordinated machinery designed to collapse the closed loops of parallel societies before they can permanently alter the political landscape. By establishing these domestic zones of suspicion, the government has set a precedent that completely rewrites the boundaries of state authority in a democratic society. But this structural enforcement inside the neighborhoods was only possible because of an equally radical transformation occurring within the highest corridors of political power. The physical clearing of the blocks required a complete dismantling of traditional political alignments, leading to an alliance that mainstream observers never thought possible. And this shift in the political balance of power is precisely where the true mechanism of this decline becomes undeniable. The central paradox of this transformation is that its most severe consequences are perfectly visible on the ground, yet entirely denied by the official narratives of state progress. We are told that these policies represent a triumph of social cohesion, a necessary, clear-eyed intervention to rescue the welfare state from fragmentation. But the reality on the street reveals a profound, permanent fracturing of the very social trust the government claims to protect. The system has achieved its numerical targets, but it has done so by creating a deep, pervasive silence that masks the true human and institutional toll. This silence operates as a powerful chilling effect across the entire landscape of Danish civic life. Inside the academic institutions and municipal offices where these policies are implemented, researchers and social workers increasingly report an atmosphere of intense professional anxiety. To publicly question the efficacy or the ethics of the integration quotas is to risk immediate political marginalization or the loss of state funding. Data regarding the long-term psychological impact on displaced families or on toddlers subjected to mandatory separation is consistently minimized or reframed as a temporary, necessary friction. The state has effectively monopolized the narrative, ensuring that any dissent is viewed not as legitimate critique, but as an attack on national survival itself. The consequence for the communities themselves is a profound sense of permanent instability. When the state establishes that legal rights, such as housing security and parental autonomy, are entirely dependent on the demographic makeup of a zip code, it strips an entire segments of the population of their sense of belonging. Families do not integrate when they live under the constant threat of administrative eviction or under the watchful eye of state-mandated cultural monitoring. Instead, they retreat into an even deeper, more resentful isolation, recognizing that the system views them not as citizens to be supported, but as statistical liabilities to be managed, scattered, and suppressed, soaming out. The implications of this model extend far beyond the borders of a single Nordic nation. Now, Denmark has provided a highly functional, legally tested blueprint for how a wealthy liberal democracy can abandon its humanitarian obligations without triggering a domestic political crisis. By successfully absorbing the hardline migration agenda into the center-left mainstream, the Danish government has shown the rest of Europe that the preservation of a generous welfare state can be used to justify almost any level of domestic state intervention. Across the continent, other administrations are watching this experiment with intense interest, preparing to adopt the same mechanical approach to their own demographic and fiscal challenges. This leaves us looking at a completely rewired Western model, where the traditional boundaries between state authority and private family life have been permanently dissolved. The Danish experiment forces an uncomfortable fundamental question into the open, one that mainstream political consensus is completely unprepared to answer. When a society decides that its own cultural and financial survival requires the systematic dismantling of its most vulnerable communities, what exactly is it left protecting? If the only way to save the world's most generous social model is to make it completely cold, calculated, and exclusive, then the system has not been preserved at all. It has simply mutated into something else entirely.